Was there a Bible canon in Jesus' day? Today we're going to look at a few pieces of evidence that'll help us answer this question. But before we get to them, what is a Bible canon? Well, a Bible canon is a set list of writings that are considered to be the list that's authoritative for a religious community. That means that if we want to know if there was a Bible canon in Jesus' day, we have to determine if, at a minimum, the Jews were agreed on which books were scripture. Did they have some sort of official list like, these are the books we accept to the exclusion of others? Did they have that sort of thing or not? Did they have a council that approved a list, or was there a list that everyone had a consensus on? As we'll see, it turns out that no, there wasn't such a list. For one thing, it's not like the Jews of Jesus' day were one monolithic religious community, and they didn't have a recognized religious council or leadership that could make doctrinal decisions that would be official or authoritative for all, or even most Jews. According to Josephus, there were three prevailing schools of Jewish thought in Jesus' day: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. And one of the reasons these groups held different beliefs had to do with the books they considered to be scripture. As a side note, there were many groups of Jews beyond these three, but most just talk about these three and the followers of Jesus, since these are the groups we know the most about. For example, here's what the Sabbath School quarterly lesson for this week says about the Sadducees. The quarterly lesson reads, quote, "The Sadducees were a priestly group that accepted only the 5 books of Moses as scripture. They did not believe in the resurrection of the dead." Close quote, Sabbath School Quarterly, Wednesday, August 28th, 2024. So the Sadducees rejected all the writings we usually think of as scripture except for the 5 books of Moses. But just because they had an opinion on which books were scripture, this doesn't mean that this opinion was an authoritative one for all the Jews of the first century. For example, we know that Jesus obviously considered more writings to be scripture than the Sadducees did. He believed in the inspired character of the writings of prophets like Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Zechariah, and Malachi, to name just a few. We'll come back to Jesus and his followers in a bit. Now, how about the Pharisees? Well, we don't have any writings from the Pharisees themselves extant from the first century, but we do know that the Pharisees were the forerunners of rabbinic Judaism, and we know from their writings that even centuries after the time of Christ, the rabbis were not totally settled on the books that should be accepted as scripture, and they knew that their predecessors weren't settled either. For example, in the Talmud, we read, quote, "Rav Judah said in the name of Rav, truly that man is to be remembered for good. And Hananiah ben Hezekiah is his name, for if not for him, the book of Ezekiel would have been hidden away because its words contradicted the words of the Torah." Close quote, and that's from Tractate Shabbat 13b. Hananiah ben Hezekiah was a Pharisaic Jew who lived about the time of Jesus and the apostles. Clearly, the Pharisees at this time hadn't already settled amongst themselves whether or not they regarded the book of Ezekiel as scripture. And Ezekiel is among the major prophets, which lets you know that the Pharisees were far from settling a Bible canon in the first century. And even as late as the 4th century CE, rabbis were still not totally settled regarding the scriptural status of certain books. For example, most eventually regarded the book known as Sirach, also called the Book of Ben Sirach, which is now found in the Apocrypha, as not being scripture. But Rabbah bar Mari of the 4th century is quoted in the Talmud as including it in Scripture. By this point, Jews divided Scripture into 3 sections: the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And Rabbah bar Mari clearly includes Sirach in the writings. Here's what it says in Bava Kama 92b. Quote, "Rabbah bar Mari explains each of the sources. It is written in the Torah, as it is written, and so Esau went to Ishmael." Genesis 28:9. It is repeated in the prophets, as it is written, "And there were gathered vain fellows to Yiftah, and they went out with him." Judges 11:3. And it is triplicated in the writings, as it is written, "All fowl will live with its kind, and men with those like him." Book of Ben Sirach 13:17. Close quote. The Talmud also contains debates over the scriptural status of books like Esther, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs, but we'll leave that for you to research on your own time. The main point, though, is that there is clear evidence that the Pharisees in Jesus' day hadn't settled on which books they considered to be scripture. It actually wasn't until centuries after Jesus' time that the rabbis finally fixed a canon. We also mentioned that there was another school of thought among the first century Jews, that of a group called the Essenes. The Essenes had a community at a place called Qumran on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, where their library was discovered in 1946 or 47, modernly known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. This library consisted of about 1,000 texts, way more than the number of texts found in our Protestant Old Testament. Interestingly, what's not found in this library is any indication of a Bible canon. For example, there's no list of which books are recognized as scripture. There's also nothing about the manuscripts themselves that marks certain books as scriptural and others as non-scriptural. And when you look at the writings actually composed by the Essenes, there's no indication that Chronicles was viewed by them as scripture. And there's no indication that the books of 1st Enoch were not viewed as scripture. Actually, from what the Essenes themselves wrote, it seems like the writings in 1st Enoch were more influential on the community than Chronicles was. And interestingly, there are even single scrolls that contain both a text that modern people would consider canonical, along with another text that modern people would not consider canonical, with no distinction made. Now, this would be truly odd if our modern Bible canon list existed in the 1st century. There's just no indication in the thousands of pieces of textual evidence at Qumran that the Essenes had any view of some sort of Bible canon. Now, scholars have traditionally divided the scrolls into biblical and non-biblical categories, but these are artificial modern divisions that only reflect distinctions in the minds of modern people. They don't reflect distinctions in the minds of ancient Jews. The last thing we'll mention for the Essenes is that they believed in the message of a prophet known as the Teacher of Righteousness, and some of his writings are preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have every reason to believe that the Essenes regarded these writings as a product of divine inspiration just as much as the writings of Isaiah, Moses, or the other prophets. This shows that even though they didn't have a Bible canon, they accepted writings as scripture which weren't accepted by either Sadducees or Pharisees. And when we look at the writings of the followers of Jesus, we again see no evidence of a Bible canon existing in the 1st century. They didn't list books they considered scripture, and they didn't have in view something to be considered as the last book of scripture or anything like that. To the contrary, what we do see is that they believed that God was still inspiring people to write his word. Remember, when Jesus was preaching, Paul hadn't written any of his letters. Revelation hadn't been written, etc. The fact that early Christians accepted these writings as scripture shows that they didn't think there was already a finalized list of books to be regarded as scripture. Furthermore, there are writings in the Old Testament for most Christians that New Testament authors never quote. So we just don't have evidence whether they thought they were scripture or not. And interestingly, there are examples of references in the New Testament to writings not included in most Christian Bibles, but that were found, however, among the Dead Sea Scrolls. For example, 1st Enoch 1:9 was quoted by Jude as something that came from Enoch himself. All this goes to show that the assumptions people make about which books should constitute the Christian Old Testament are not based on how the authors of the books of the New Testament make use of earlier writings. Beyond this is the whole issue of when Christians established lists of which books should be part of the New Testament. As it turns out, this also didn't take place in the 1st century. In fact, disagreements as to which books should be considered New Testament scripture persisted for centuries, even among the most prominent groups of Christians. As an example, Catholics didn't finally settle which books should constitute their Old and New Testaments until the Council of Trent in 1546. Since debates over which books should be considered scripture continued for many centuries after the time of Jesus among both Jews and Christians, it should be clear that in the time of Jesus, the Bible canon hadn't yet come into existence. And again, when considering the ancient evidence, we find that there was no official Jewish body that had doctrinal authority in Jesus' day, but rather there were many different Jewish schools of thought, including those of the Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes, and the followers of Jesus, among others. We also saw historical evidence that each group considered different texts to be scripture, with no evidence of a fixed list of writings to be considered authoritative. No idea of a Bible canon anywhere among any of these writings. From all this evidence, we can know that there was not a Bible canon in Jesus' day. Thank you for staying with us till the end. We invite you to visit our website, www.bdsda.com, to learn more about who we are and, just as important, who we are not. Please join us as we'll continue to offer new and interesting insights for your Sabbath School studies. And if you want to keep up with our new studies as they're published, we recommend subscribing. We're on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on plenty of other podcast apps. Links for subscribing are in the description. From Ed and me, Many blessings.